Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Hathcock again. So now with this topic, what we're going to do is we're going to look at those who opposed slavery. Our last topic, we kind of set up what slavery was, the impact it had. Now let's look at those who came to see it as evil and fought back. All right. The problem of anti-slavery and race, letter A here in America, is that truth be told, racism was north, south, everywhere in the United States at that time. There were a lot of people who believed in a concept called white supremacy, which always went hand in hand with the concept of black inferiority. Neither one of those are true, by the way, but back in the 1800s, a lot of that was considered to be scientific fact, the idea of white supremacy and black inferiority. So people living up north may not have owned slaves, but people up north did believe in white supremacy. They were, in fact, racist themselves. You can go back and read a lot of the newspaper articles leading up to the Civil War. Newspaper editors would say things like, supposing the slaves were free, they could move up here. They probably wouldn't take our jobs, talking like that. They would also say up north, if the slaves were freed, they could move up here, live next door to me. I don't want them living next door to me. So there was a lot of racism in the north as well as down in the south. And those who opposed slavery, kind of like the wall they kept running into, was, hey, I want to pass legislation to free the slaves. I want to eradicate this evil institution. But then there are these people up north who say, well, what's the big deal? Black inferiority is true. It's better than living down south in chained and, quote, taken care of than being free and living up here next door to me. So every time some sort of a group would come together, try to fight for the abolition of slavery, they usually ran into that brick wall of racism in the United States. The first group to really take a stance against slavery was a religious group called the Quakers. Quakers had this belief that human beings had what they called God's inner light. That is to say, if you could speak, communicate, rationalize, you were in essence human. You had this light that was given to you by God, this spark, if you will. And the Quakers argued that anyone who was human, who had the spark, the light of God, uh, it was uh, it was against God's will to enslave or enchain that person. So the Quakers, that religious organization, they really were the first to make that stand, at least in the United States, or what becomes the United States anyway, against slavery. But the Quakers are primarily out of Pennsylvania. That's not entirely true. They were in other areas as well. But yeah, we do credit them as being the first organized group to resist the institution of slavery. All right. Well, along the way, there's this next group, letter B, the American Colonization Society. It's founded on January the 1st, 1817. And the ACS had this big idea of trying to solve two problems at once. The American Colonization Society does want to free the slaves, but it also recognizes the racism problem in America as well. So it's trying to solve both things. It's trying to end the institution of slavery while at the same time satisfying the racism of the American people. Here's what the American Colonization Society called for. They said, okay, so let's work hard to free the slaves. We'll set a deadline date in the future, try to work with Congress to pass legislation, but we work really hard towards getting slavery itself eradicated. And then once the slaves are free, we are going to transport them to Africa, set them up a colony in Africa where they can live in peace and do as they please. So you're basically saying to America, look, we're going to end this god awful institution, and we'll also satisfy your racist tendencies by removing the freed slaves altogether, taking them to Africa where they can live in a colony. The ACS actually went so far as to get the the colony in question. The nation of Liberia was founded by the American Colonization Society. Liberia is in Africa. Liberia's capital city is Monrovia. That was named in honor of President James Monroe, president at the time of the founding of Liberia. And Liberia was supposed to be that colony where the freed slaves of America would be transported to. There are a lot of people who supported this idea. Henry Clay supported this idea. Later, Andrew Jackson supported this idea. I think it's like one of the few things Jackson and Clay agree on, or could agree on, was this ACS idea. So, yeah, this is something that would always be there. Like, even as the Civil War was starting, President Abraham Lincoln was clinging to this. Lincoln said, instead of fighting the war, let's not spend all that blood. Let's spend money. Let's do this colonization idea in Liberia. So even in the earliest phases of Lincoln's presidency, he was grasping at this as a possible solution. Well, the ACS ran into some problems. Problem number one was funding, the money that it would take to create this Liberian colony and to do it the right way. People up north, who, though they themselves did not own slaves, basically did not want to fork up the money to pay for removing freed slaves. If this is really going to work, it's going to have the government support. The ACS knew that. They constantly worked with Congress to try to get Congress to fund, building the colony, getting the ships for transportation. And that meant that the American taxpayer, if Congress says yes, the American taxpayer is the one who's going to have to pay for all this. And it turns out dirt poor farmers up in Vermont, they don't want to pay for what they see as essentially a Southern problem. An Ohio farmer would have said, okay, so let me get this straight. I don't own any slaves, but you're going to use my tax dollars to settle a problem that essentially belongs down south. And yes, if the ACS had been given congressional funding, that's exactly how that would have played out. So folks up north don't like it because it's too expensive. And folks down south didn't care for it because they didn't want to free their slaves. The ACS would try to explain what it was doing, and Southerners would say, okay, well, you have a problem. I don't want to free my slaves. I'm making money off this. I'm quite comfortable with this institution. So, yeah, the South didn't want it because they didn't want to free their slaves. And the North didn't want it because it was going to be too expensive. But Liberia was founded. There were some, just a handful of freed slaves who were taken to Liberia. Here's another god-awful truth. There were some free African Americans living up north who were kidnapped and taken to Liberia against their will. All right, so the ACS did not accomplish what it hoped it could. All right, gradual emancipation is another idea that was always out there. You might recall the Talmadge Amendment was gradual emancipation. That is to say, you sort of set up a law that calls for getting rid of slavery, but it's not immediate. It takes a little time. It's going to take maybe some years, some decades, but eventually slavery does come to an end in a state, an area, whatever it might be. And there are a lot of people who work really hard for gradual emancipation. That it can't be so sudden that would be too much of a shock to the South's economy, but eventually we could get rid of slavery. One guy who was really big on the gradual emancipation concept is Mr. Benjamin Lundy. You can see him here on the top right of our slide. Lundy was a Quaker. He'd grown up with that religious belief of the inner light and all of that. And, Lundy just was a big, firm believer in if you just sat down with someone and talked with them in an honest, rational way, you could get them to see that they are wrong and that what you're saying is right. So all you need here is honesty and a willingness to explain what's right and what's wrong. So Lundy came to the South. He would go before crowds of people in Mississippi or Alabama, and he would start explaining to them that slavery was evil, that it was immoral, that it was wrong, that they should free their slaves because in having slaves, they themselves are being evil and wrong. And yeah, people in Mississippi and Alabama ran this guy out of town. They threw rotten vegetables at him. They tried to hit him. They had him on the run for his life. It turns out when you sit down and try to talk to someone in an honest, rational way, and you're telling them that they're wrong, they get really defensive when you do that. They feel the need to defend themselves and lash out and fight back. Because all you got to do to get somebody to quit smoking is just show them the pictures of charred lungs. And talk to them about how, hey, your cigarette smoke it's not just giving you cancer, it's giving other people cancer as well through secondhand smoke. That's all you got to do, right? And people will quit smoking. All you got to do to get someone to stop drinking and driving is show them photographs of families that have been wiped out by drunk drivers. And just sit down with them one-on-one and explain how, this is wrong. Getting in a car while you're drunk is wrong to do. That'll stop them drinking, right? I often tell my face-to-face students, hey, if I want somebody to quit texting in the middle of my lectures, all I got to do is sit down with them and explain to them how it has a negative impact on their grade. And it's really rude to do to your instructor. And, I'm sure that they'll stop texting during lectures. Actually, what happens when you sit down with someone and you try to explain to them why they're wrong, and they get upset. They feel the need to defend themselves and push back and to fight back. So Lundy didn't really have a lot of success. I give the guy credit, though, man. He kept fighting the fight. And Lundy also had this other idea. Let me know if you've heard this before. Lundy said that whenever the deadline day came, like whenever gradual emancipation eventually freed all the slaves, Lundy said that what we ought to do is create a territory out west where all the freed slaves can be relocated somewhere out west of the Mississippi where they can live their lives in peace. And that kind of sounds like Jackson's Indian removal policy, right? Just send them on out west to live their lives in peace in a freed slave territory, if you will. All right. Well, Lundy really did try. I give the guy credit. He really did try. He fought the good fight against the institution of slavery. All right, looking at Nat Turner's Rebellion, letter C number 2 here. This was a huge setback for those who opposed slavery. But, Nat Turner did what he did, and I can't necessarily blame the guy. If I was enslaved, I probably would have tried to fight back too. I'd like to think I would, right? That I would try to fight back. But anywho, Nat Turner is a slave. He was in Virginia. It was real close to the North Carolina border. There's a place called Southampton County, Virginia, where Nat Turner was being held as a slave. Nat Turner showed some abilities as a young man, so much so that his owner taught him how to read and write. But it wasn't education just for education's sake. What Nat Turner's owner wanted to do was teach him the Bible, teach him how to read the Bible, certain things to say about the Bible, because Nat Turner's owner was like many owners in the South. He wanted his slaves to learn about Jesus, learn the Bible. Nat Turner's owner felt it was important for his slaves to understand the Bible, and he was really trying to save their souls. It's fascinating to me that you mistreat them the way you do, but you are very concerned about their Christian salvation. Well, anyways, Nat Turner grows up. He is educated in the sense that he can read and write, that he understands the Bible. And Nat Turner was preaching to those slaves there on that plantation. He was also used to preach to other slaves in the surrounding area, the Word of God. And along the way, Nat Turner just began to realize the intolerable cruelty of slavery, the hypocrisy of teaching about tolerance in the Word of God, but then, these white slave masters are mistreating their slaves. He also came to realize that they were using the Bible to sort of pacify the slaves. That the Bible is big on how slaves should behave. Old Testament, anyway, is. The Bible also talks about hardship in this life, reward in the next. So he also came to realize that those white slaveholders in Virginia who would have him preach to their slaves, they were using him, in a sense. So in 1831, Nat Turner also said that he was seeing these visions. He was having these dreams. That year there was a solar eclipse that summer of 1831, and Nat Turner took that as a sign from God to carry out his plan when that solar eclipse took place. So Nat Turner and a few of his followers on the plantation, in the middle of the night, they got into the master's home. They killed their owner, his family, thus freeing those slaves on that plantation. They then traveled down the road to the next plantation where they carried out the same thing, broke into the master's home, killed that white family, freed those slaves. So that as Nat Turner's rebellion went forward, it was growing in strength and in size. Free a plantation, all those slaves join your cause, and it keeps going and going and going. All right, the problem with Nat Turner's rebellion is it didn't really have an end game. I guess the idea was just to keep going and keep fighting, but there wasn't really sort of a plan for ending it all. Like for instance, I mean, they could have gone off into the Appalachian Mountains or something, and tried to live in peace there. But anyway, Nat Turner and his followers. There's the story of a guy on horseback. He was rounding a bend and he was going down a road. When he slowed up because he saw a whole bunch of freed slaves sort of milling about in the road up ahead. He would later say that from his vantage point, it looked like no good was going to come of him riding down that road. All the freed slaves were looking at him. He was looking at them. So he very quickly turned his horse around and went the other way. The slaves in the road yelled and started chasing after him. They couldn't catch him. He was on horse. This gentleman on horseback alerts the authorities to this big gathering of slaves out there on that road. So now the authorities are alerted. The Virginia militia is called in. And it took some time, but eventually the state of Virginia, its military forces, will put down Nat Turner's uprising. The rebellion is squashed, if you will. By the time it's all said and done, some 60 whites are dead. And we really don't know how many hundreds of slaves were killed in the fight back against Nat Turner's rebellion. They just kind of stopped keeping numbers at some point. But we know that a lot of slaves did die. Well, Nat Turner, for his part, went on the run. He was like the most wanted man in America for about a month. Later that summer, 1831, there was a man who was going out to his barn, and he heard a commotion in his barn. He went back and got his rifle and came out and said, "Hey, whoever you are, come on down." And who should come down out of the guy's barn but Nat Turner? He's cold, he's hungry, he's in a bad state. But the farmer captures Nat Turner, turns him into the authorities in Richmond. There, Nat Turner is given a trial that didn't last very long. He's made to sign a confession that he didn't write. And Nat Turner was taken out back and summarily executed for inciting a slave rebellion there in Virginia. Now, in the aftermath of this Nat Turner rebellion, a lot of things happened here. This is a very significant moment in American history. It's a really big deal. It was the largest slave uprising ever in American history. But let's look at the impact on the North first, and then we'll look at what the impact was in the South. From a Northern perspective, Nat Turner's rebellion was proof that the slave is not happy being enslaved. In fact, what Nat Turner's rebellion represented to people of North was the slave yearns for freedom. He's willing to fight and die for that freedom. So that's the Northern take on Nat Turner's rebellion, is the slaves are not happy. They yearn for freedom. They're willing to fight and die for it. Its real impact, though, is on the South. There's no denying that. So let's look at what happened down south as a result of Nat Turner's rebellion. This was the South's worst nightmare come true, what happened here in Virginia in 1831. Southerners had always been terrified that their slaves might rise up, kill them in their sleep, seek retribution and things like that. And that's what happened here in Virginia. So all across the South, they started passing more laws to sort of tighten their grip on slavery. As a result of Nat Turner's rebellion, these slave patrols began to pop up across the South. Slave patrol worked like this. One family would be tasked with riding across the county at night, just kind of keeping an eye on things and making sure all was right. It might be the Smith family for a solid week, and the Smith family would have to ride across, say, a Tarrant County. Just keep an eye on things, just watch the roads, watch the area, and just make sure things were okay. Then the next week, it might be the Jones family. They got to ride across Tarrant County, make sure everything's okay. So it did start those slave patrols. Once it was found out that Nat Turner could read and write, that caused a lot of Southerners to say, well, that's it right there. That's why he led this uprising. He was educated. So a lot of Southern states began to pass laws that said you could not educate a slave, that it was illegal for them to be able to read or write. Truth be told, a lot of the South already had those laws, but any state that did not yet have that law very quickly passed that law, making it illegal to educate a slave. Really, the reaction of the South to Nat Turner's rebellion was, we got to hold on to this thing tighter. We got to pass more laws. We got to be more proactive. And any idea of freeing slaves in the South, that's not being talked about in 1831. In 1831, after Nat Turner's rebellion, it was, we got to tighten our grip on this thing because we don't want our slaves killing us in the middle of the night. Southerners said, you know what, if I freed my slaves, I can't watch them. They could move 5-10 miles down the road, and then at some point they might say, you know what, I'm going to go seek retribution against my former owner for what he did. And then in the middle of the night, they break into my home and they kill me. They actually said this. They said it was better that they're here. I can keep an eye on them. I know where they are. Then they're off wandering somewhere and could show up in the middle of the night and kill me. That's a crazy paranoid attitude to have. But that's the South's feelings, especially after Nat Turner's rebellion. They ain't freeing their slaves anytime soon. All right, well, there was a group of individuals who came to stand against slavery, known as the radical abolitionists. Looking here, letter D, radical abolitionism. I think the first statement to make about these individuals is that for them, the fight against slavery was very much a religious crusade. It was about the Bible. It was about good versus evil. It's not really a political fight for the radical abolitionists. It's more about the Word of God and what's right and what's wrong. The radical abolitionists had a lot of people within their following, tens of thousands. You could argue hundreds of thousands even. But they did not speak for the majority of people living in the North. I'll explain that as we go. Well, the most famous of the radical abolitionists is William Lloyd Garrison, the fellow on the bottom left-hand side of our slide. He's not the only person involved in this fight. He just happens to be the most famous of the radical abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison may not look like much, but I promise you that's a package of dynamite there. There's a lion in that heart. And William Lloyd Garrison just dedicated his entire life to the destruction of slavery. Garrison said that as a Christian man, he never could understand how his fellow Christians living in the South could tolerate the evil of the institution of slavery. And he said that as a Christian man, he was compelled to fight against it, to fight against this sin, this evil that was in the United States. So Garrison was very vocal. He was very outspoken in his opposition to slavery. He would eventually come to found a newspaper called The Liberator, and The Liberator really was like the media for those who opposed slavery, those who were involved in the abolitionist cause. The Liberator would print stories of mistreatment of slaves, of lynchings and hangings and things like that. Would also keep people informed of sort of legal efforts to try to eradicate the institution. Along the way, Garrison also founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. Had a very slow start, the society did. But by 1860, the American Anti-Slavery Society had about 250,000 members within its ranks. That's a pretty decent-sized organization right there, 250,000 members within its ranks. But here's the thing that we always try to point out as historians. At that same time, there's like 21 million people living in the North. So the 250,000 that were hardcore abolitionists, they really didn't speak for the 21 million. that lived up north. In fact, a lot of people living up north, they saw the abolitionists as troublemakers. They wanted them to shut up and stop agitating, or they were going to cause a war. Well, Garrison, for his part, didn't care what they thought, and Garrison always said that the message matters more than the man. And what Garrison would do was some theatrics, some antics, to try to get people to listen to him, try to kind of spread that word, that abolitionist cause. Now, there's a story of him being in Boston. He's up on a stage and he's talking to a crowd of people. And at some point in his talk, he pulls out a copy of the U.S. Constitution and he holds it up to the crowd and he says, "This is a contract with Satan. This document allows for the sin of slavery." And he says, I believe our country needs to break free of the chains of the devil. And Garrison lit a match and started burning a copy of the Constitution right there on the stage. Well, there were some good old boys in Boston who didn't really care for their Constitution being burnt by this crazy. So some guys rushed the stage. They grabbed Garrison. They dragged him off the stage. They put a whooping on him as they dragged him off the stage. The crowd took him to a nearby tree. They'd fashioned a rope around a branch in the tree. They had a noose around Garrison's neck, and they were about to hang him right there in Boston when the police showed up just in time and got the crowd to disperse and run away. That's in Boston, y'all. That's not down in Atlanta, Georgia. That's not New Orleans, Louisiana. That's way up north in Boston, Massachusetts. And see, people in Boston were mad at him for doing that. People up north were mad at the abolitionist period for these antics, for these ideas, and for the trouble that they were causing. Anyway, so, okay, Garrison does that. It's going to get headlines. It's going to be in the newspaper. You know, crazy burns Constitution. Is nearly hanged by crowd. So that, I don't know, 4 days later, he's down the road in another town and people show up because they're like, I wonder what he's going to do this time. Wonder if he'll burn the Constitution today, you know? What's he going to do this time? And his hope was that they would show up not just to see something crazy. His hope was they would show up and listen to what he had to say. Well, if Garrison was sort of the brains behind the operation, Frederick Douglass was the heart and soul of the radical abolitionist cause. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery. As he himself put it, his father was his master. This is a case of a white slave-owning man having sex with one of his African-American slaves, and out of that is born Frederick Douglass. As often happened in those cases, the white slave owner would often sell that child away real quick. They didn't want to be reminded of what they had done, particularly if they had a wife in that scenario. The wife in particular wanted that child gone, far away. And how sad is that they were selling their own flesh and blood, their own children, to be enchained, to be brutally treated. But yeah, Fred Douglass's father very quickly sold him away at a young age. Let's see. His second owner, we really don't know the full story here. Fred Douglass didn't even know the full story here. But for whatever reason, that second owner, oh, and by the way, he's in Maryland, in and around the Baltimore, Maryland area, growing up. For whatever reason, the wife in that house, that second ownership, she taught him how to read and write. We don't know why. Fred Douglass doesn't even know why. But he received that little bit of an education as a young man. At some point, her husband found out that Fred Douglass could read and write, was educated. He panicked, he freaked. He knew that if that was discovered, he would be imprisoned, he could be beaten with lashes. All kinds of bad stuff could happen. So just to sort of rid himself of it all, the second owner sold him away real quickly as well. And like by the time this guy is, say, 8 years old, he's got a third owner, just going from house to house. Well, this third owner, you can't help but believe that there's a special section of hell for horrible people like this guy. He was very cruel. He was quick to the lash to beat. Frederick Douglass, rather than be beaten, decided to run away. He was captured, brought back, beaten again. Tried another attempt at running away, was captured and beaten again. He had lashes all across his back, scars that would be with him for the rest of his life. because he kept trying to run. But his third attempt at running away was successful, thank goodness. Story goes he was sitting on a train and he had these forged papers. And he said that all the conductor had to do as he came around to check people's documents, their tickets, their paper. He said all the conductor had to do was just take a moment to look over his documents, and he'd have sniffed them out as a fake for sure. But Douglas is in the back of a train. Guy's coming around. He's asking for people's paperwork. He's checking it. And Douglas said his heart was racing 1,000 beats a minute. The conductor was walking near him. And for whatever reason, the conductor just didn't stop at him. The conductor didn't even bother to look at his paperwork. Don't know why. Maybe the guy knew that was trouble if he asked. Maybe the guy just, I don't know, had something in his heart, feeling of sympathy. I don't know what it is. But Douglas stays on the train. The train eventually makes its way up north into Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So now Frederick Douglass is in the north. He is free. He's in Philadelphia. He'll eventually go on to New York City, but his first stop was there in Philadelphia. Douglass said that when he arrived in the north, he arrived at freedom. He was at first elated that he was out of the South, but then he said he found a new type of racism waiting for him up north. Whereas racism down south was very violent, in your face. He said the racism of the north was very cold and uncaring. It was a racism of, hey, you live on your side of town, I stay on mine. I don't want to see you. I don't want anything to do with you. Go live your life on the other side of the railroad tracks. It was kind of the feeling of that racism up north. He did his best as he could to survive in the streets of Philadelphia, but I don't know. There weren't that many jobs to be had, especially for a young African American man. Again, they didn't want anything to do with him. He found out real quick that libraries were free to the public and open. They made for nice little getaways on rainy, cold days. And what Frederick Douglass did was he tried to scrape a living as best he could. He read books to keep himself entertained, and in so many ways, he's a self-educated man. Once he reaches adulthood, he decides to write his life story, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. But he had a really hard time finding a publisher for this story. Nobody would publish it. The publishing houses would send back a letter and say, this is a lie. There's no way that you were ever a slave. There's no way that anyone who was ever a slave could write like this or tell this story this way. So publishing houses in America refused to believe him. They thought it was a lie. He eventually found a publishing house, but it was in England. It was across the ocean. They said that they would publish it. Once it published, it started to sell really good. It's sold in the north of the United States as well. It's sold in Europe. It didn't sell that well down in the south of the United States for some reason. But anyway, now Douglass has some money coming in. He's generating enough of a revenue that he doesn't have to worry about basic things like survival. And with that revenue coming in, Douglass just decided to dedicate his life to the fight against slavery. He'll join the radical abolitionist cause. He'll team up with Garrison, so that as this show, if you will, traveled across the north, they didn't really go down south. They understood going down south, they'd probably be killed. In fact, in the state of Georgia, there was a standing bounty on Garrison's head, that if anyone could kill Garrison and bring him to Georgia, there was a bounty that person could collect. That's pretty crazy stuff to have a bounty on your head like that. But anywho, so Garrison would get people to show up, right? The crazy antics, the burning of the Constitution, all that. Then people would come to see what's the crazy going to do. But when they showed up to hear the crazy, at some point they heard Fred Douglass. And the first astonishing thing for that crowd of people, that crowd of white people in the North, would have been that an African American was on stage addressing them. Like, I'm not kidding, that would have blown their mind. They would have just sat there with their mouths open like, what the heck is going on here? And as Frederick Douglass would speak, it was very obvious that he had a gift for oratory, that he was a very good public speaker, that he was an educated and knowledgeable man. And as he would start to tell his life story, at some point he would often get heckled. Somebody in the crowd would say, you were never a slave. No, sir, there is no way that someone as well-spoken as you grew up as a slave. If the heckling got to be too much, Douglas would often stop, take off his coat, pull up the back of his shirt, and just allow the crowd to see the scars that he had on his back from the whippings that he had taken as a young man. They get real quiet real quick when they saw those scars on his back. And they realized in that moment this isn't a lie. This man actually was a slave at one point. Just look at the scars on his back. And somewhere in their little white supremacy minds was rattling around this truth as they listened to Douglas. And the truth is, white supremacy is a lie. Everything that I believed about white supremacy and black inferiority, it's not true. Because this man on this stage is the equal of any white man I've ever met. And it turns out, if given a chance at an education, anyone can achieve anything. It's not about race. So he was walking, talking, living proof that white supremacy was a lie and black inferiority was a lie as well. Well, Douglas agitated his whole life. Eventually the war came, Civil War that is. And when the war came, Douglas met Abraham Lincoln on an occasion or two. And Abraham Lincoln was very impressed in his talks and his meetings with Frederick Douglass. And Lincoln came to realize in meeting with Douglass that white supremacy was in fact a lie, that black inferiority was as well. So he had a real change on Lincoln's thinking as the country was heading into Civil War. Later in the Civil War, Lincoln was toying with the idea of allowing African American men to serve in combat, to serve in the Union Army. He talked to Douglas about that and wanted to know what Douglas thought about young African American men serving in combat for the Union Army. Lincoln's military advisors had told him these soldiers, they won't fight, they'll run. First shot to fire, they'll get scared and they'll run for their lives. But Douglas heard the president out and smiled and said, "Are you kidding me? These men will fight like lions for you on that battlefield. They have more at stake in this than any white man in uniform. Because when these men take the field, they'll be fighting for their fathers, their mothers, their sisters, their brothers who are still bound in chains down in the South. They will give everything they have for the liberation of their families." With that advice, Lincoln does go on and call for African Americans to serve in combat, and Douglas was correct. They fought valiantly. They fought like lions. They didn't run, when the shots were fired. They fought hard for the liberation of slaves. When the war came to an end and freedom came, Douglas realized that it wasn't going to be a full freedom, that African Americans were not going to be given all the rights of citizenship, that they would be denied their, quote, civil rights. So Douglas agitated for equality. He fought for civil rights. And up to the day he died, he just agitated and fought for the rights of African American people. And what we always say is the first true champion of African Americans was Frederick Douglass. He's the one who carried that torch, that banner, that fight for freedom. That's a torch that will later be passed on to other individuals, ultimately culminating with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. along the way as well. So yeah, this is a man who has a huge impact on American history, Mr. Frederick Douglass. All right, well, believe it or not, there's a difference between being an abolitionist and being anti-slavery. And here is that difference. In looking at it, I guess you might make yourself a chart. On one side, put abolitionism. Sort of draw a line down your paper. It doesn't have to be the whole paper. Just some sort of a demarcation line. And then on the other side, put anti-slavery. And then off to the side of your chart, the first thing I would like for you to write is, let's go with religion first. Just put religion there. All right. For abolitionists, this was all about religion. So you might put a check next to religion under abolitionism. For them, it's about the Bible. It's good versus evil. So it's absolutely a religious crusade. Anti-slavery, it's not really about religion. And that's not to say they didn't go to church, because they did. But it wasn't really this good versus evil fight in their eyes. So when it comes to religion, abolitionists are very much about the religious aspect of the fight. Anti-slavery is not really coming from that angle. The next thing to write out to the side would be politics. And abolitionists did not have any use for politics. You could put an X there under abolitionism. They did not like politics. They felt that the Constitution was a contract with the devil because it allowed for slavery. They felt that the Congress had been hijacked by what they called the slave power conspiracy. They really hated Henry Clay. It seemed like every time Henry Clay opened his mouth, slavery got like 10, 20 more years to exist. So they don't care for politicians. They think the country's been hijacked by the slave power conspiracy, and they really don't see a political solution to the problem. Anti-slavery, though, was very much about politics. So you can put a check mark under there. Anti-slavery and politics, they are absolutely believing that there is a political solution to this problem. Anti-slavery believes that at some point you can pass legislation to eradicate slavery. It might take 70 years, it might take 100 years, but at some point there could be a political solution to the institution of slavery. Okay, the next thing to look at, I'm going to call it slavery in the states. And abolitionists did not want slavery in the states. They don't want it anywhere, truth be told. So under abolitionism, you'd put an X next to slavery in the states. They want the thing gone altogether, eradicated. They don't want it anywhere. Anti-slavery, though, said that they were willing to allow for slavery in the states. That Mississippi, Virginia, Alabama, places like that, they could keep their slave property. So they were willing to allow slavery in the states as it already did exist. Anti-slavery is not out to eradicate the institution in the states. But this next point is a very important point. It's slavery in the territories. And neither the abolitionists or anti-slavery wanted slavery out west in the territories. And that's a line that the anti-slavery people will not cross. Both the abolitionists and anti-slavery oppose the institution of slavery out west in the territories. And anti-slavery basically said this, look, slavery can stay in the states where it exists. We're not out to destroy the institution in the states, but we are not going to allow slavery to spread out west into the territories. And the thinking was this, if you can stop slavery from spreading out west into the territories, then eventually as America completes manifest destiny, as we have states from sea to shining sea, the West, your California, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, all of that, Kansas, once those areas become states, they'll be free states. If there are no slaves there during the territorial process, why would those territories elect to have slavery when they don't have any slaves? So the idea of the anti-slavery crusade is, or the anti-slavers is, someday we're going to have a lot of states out west that will not have slavery. If we can stop it from spreading out to the territories, those territories eventually become states, they'll become free states. So that the West and the North together should be able to have 75% of Congress, and that together the North and the West could amend the Constitution, which again, it takes 75% of Congress to amend the Constitution. But if you could get the North and the West together, the so-called free states together, at some point in the future, they could pass an amendment to the Constitution eradicating slavery. That's how they believed politics could solve this problem. That it was a patience game, it was a waiting game. But eventually the West and the North combined could make an amendment to the Constitution, thus eradicating slavery. Well, let's hypothetically take that idea out. Let's say that, I don't know, it's 1901, and we've got all these states out west that have been created to this point, and the West and the North are working hard, and they amend the Constitution. They managed to get an amendment passed that calls for slavery being illegal. and this is in 1901. Okay, that very next day in 1901, the South will secede. The Southern states will fight that. They will not allow for that to be. They will go to arms and they will go to war to defend the institution of slavery. So I don't think there really was a political solution to be had here. I think that in that future scenario where the North and the West combined them in the Constitution, I still think the South fights back. I still think they secede and wage civil war whenever that amendment might be passed. So the abolitionists said that really the only way to get rid of slavery was through war. Anti-slavery believes that the institution will end with politics, an amendment to the Constitution. But abolitionists believe that it's going to take a war. Abolitionists said it wasn't just going to be a war, it was going to be God's punishment upon the United States. They talked of a bloodletting of epic proportions that was headed our way for the sin of slavery. So abolitionists believed the only way to get rid of slavery was through combat, through war, through God's punishment, his reckoning upon the land. Well, we did have a civil war. There were roughly 7 million human beings that passed away, that died in the conflict. And that is America's bloodletting right there. For real, you can take all of our other wars combined, World War II, World War I, the American Revolution, all of it, Vietnam, Korea. You can take all the other wars that America has waged. You can add all together all the casualties of all those wars. And that number that you would come up with does not eclipse the 7 million that died in the U.S. Civil War. And God help us if we ever have another event where 7 million Americans die. That'd be a sad, horrible day if that were ever to come to be. So it was a bloodletting. Now, was it God's punishment upon the land? I'll leave that up to you to decide. That's your choice to make there. But it was a bloodletting of epic proportions for sure. But here's a true statement as well. It did take the war to eradicate slavery, but the full eradication of slavery came with an amendment to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment. So it's kind of a case of they're both right. The abolitionists are right that it did take a war to get things headed in that direction through the eradication of slavery. The war is what brings on the Emancipation Proclamation. But even at war's end, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. It didn't technically end the institution of slavery. So at war's end, an amendment to the Constitution had to be passed, the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. So there's a bit of they're both right in what it took to eradicate slavery from the country. But here's my point. There's a difference between being an abolitionist and being anti-slavery. I'll give you some names with this. William Lloyd Garrison is an abolitionist. Abraham Lincoln is anti-slavery. And they had different ideas on how to fight this fight. They want the same end game, really. They do. They want the eradication of slavery. They're going about it in different ways. So William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist, and Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery. In the 1860 campaign, Abraham Lincoln made it very clear to the voters. He said, "I'm not out to destroy slavery in the states. But," he said, "I will not allow slavery to spread out west into the territories." That's not a radical abolitionist stance. Now, the South still called him a radical abolitionist. He really wasn't, though. He was anti-slavery. All right, well, in looking at letter F here, an evaluation of radical abolitionism, number one, contemporary views is when they were alive. We are all contemporaries of each other. We are all judging each other, I guess you could say. We're all alive at the same time. Well, their contemporary view, both North and South, is that they were hated. But there's a little more to the story than that. Let's look at it from a Northern perspective for starters. The folks living up north, they saw the radical abolitionists as agitators, as troublemakers, as people who were going to start a war. And I think Elijah Lovejoy is a really good example of how radical abolitionists were hated up in the north. All right, well, Elijah Lovejoy is a Presbyterian minister. He's a man of God. He's a preacher man. And he lived in the city of Alton, Illinois. Now, Alton, Illinois was right up against, real close to the Mississippi River. And on the other side of the Mississippi River is the state of Missouri. And really, that's sort of like ground zero for this slavery fight. On one side of the Mississippi is Missouri, it's a slave state. On the other side of the river is Illinois, and it's a free soil state. Well, Alton, Illinois, Elijah Lovejoy, I'm sorry. What he liked to do was print abolitionist propaganda. He would print these little sort of newsletters. He would print them up. He would then get on a boat. He'd travel down the Mississippi. The boat would land in St. Louis, and he would like to walk around in the town of St. Louis and hand out his anti-slavery message, his propaganda. A few folks, would sort of raise eyebrows, yell at him, question him, and things like that. Truth be told, most people in St. Louis just sort of looked at his newsletter and just thought, he's a crackpot. Just crumple it up and throw it on the ground. I'm sure you've been walking through a town, going off to do something like Dallas, for example, and you walk by and somebody hands you a little pamphlet and you look at it and it's some advertisement. And you probably just, once you round the corner, crumple it up and throw it in the trash. It's kind of like that. But truth be told, the people in St. Louis, they just sort of laughed it off, didn't care, whatever, didn't bother them. But actually, it was the people back in Alton, Illinois, who wanted him to stop doing that. They said, look, nothing but trouble can come of this. You're agitating and you're going to spark a conflict. You're going to get people killed here along the Missouri-Illinois border. So it was actually people in Alton, Illinois who wanted him to stop, who impressed upon him that he needed to stop. Well, he informed them that he had freedom of speech and he also had freedom of the press. He could print that material as he pleased. So he just kept on printing and he kept on agitating. And at some point, some of the good people of Alton, Illinois, broke into his home while he wasn't there. They grabbed his printing press and smashed it into pieces. Then they threw it in the Mississippi River for good measure, so he couldn't find it. Well, man, this guy's really committed. He ordered a second printing press and had that thing delivered to the Alton, Illinois warehouse, where he picked it up, brought it home, put it together, and he started doing it again. By the way, a printing press wasn't a cheap thing. That was a pretty expensive machine that you'd have to buy. Well, he's starting to do it again, and folks in Alton are upset again. So one more time, they break into his home and they bust up his printing press and they throw it into pieces in the river. Man, this guy is hardcore dedicated. He had a third one of those bad boys on the way. But this time, those folks in Alton, Illinois got a little wise. They talked to a young man who worked at the warehouse where it would be shipped to. They said, hey, look, if a big old box shows up and it's got the name Elijah Lovejoy on the side of it, will you let us know? We're pretty sure what that's going to be. Well, sure enough, eventually a big old box arrives at that warehouse with the name Elijah Lovejoy on the side of it. So young man lets them know, hey, that box y'all were looking for, it did arrive. And a crowd of Alton, Illinois' finest shows up at the warehouse. They're demanding entry. They demand that they want the box. The guy who owns the warehouse is trying to stop the crowd from breaking in. He's telling them, look, I got customers. This is private property. They don't care. They're doing their best to try to break in and get the big box. Meanwhile, Lovejoy figures out what's going on, and he comes running down to the warehouse. And he's standing in front of it saying, disperse. This is private property. I have a right to this. And at some point in that altercation in front of that warehouse, a couple of good old boys decided they'd had enough. They leveled their shotguns, and they took aim, and they fired. And they killed Elijah Lovejoy right there on sight. They shot him down dead. At that point, crazy kicked in. The crowd kicked in. They burst through the warehouse. They got the printing press. They smashed it. They caught it on fire, destroyed it. And they went extra crazy and just decided to burn the whole warehouse down to the ground. Poor guy who owned that warehouse, getting caught up in this mess. Point here is, though, is that Elijah Lovejoy has been killed by a group of armed people in Illinois. Not in Mississippi, not in Alabama, not in Missouri, but in the free state of Illinois. And this was shocking for the American people. Headlines across America, people could not believe that a white man had been killed by a white mob over slavery. And it was just sort of an unsettling thing for the country to deal with, this death of Elijah Lovejoy. Well, it is proof that even the people of the North didn't care for these radical abolitionists. They want them to shut up, stop agitating, causing problems. So much so that Elijah Lovejoy lost his life over this. All right, their contemporary view down south, yeah, they're the devil incarnate. Southerners see them as just pure evil. These radical abolitionists who just attack them constantly, ridicule them, deride them, call them evil, attack their institution of slavery. And, as the South was attacked, they felt the need to defend. Then, Calhoun comes out with that positive good statement, making the South feel all better about itself. So down south, they really came to despise and detest the radical abolitionists. So they really were despised north and south. But looking at their historical impact, their historical impact on the North works like this. They made anti-slavery look moderate in the eyes of Northern voters. I've always put it like this. William Lloyd Garrison made Abraham Lincoln electable in the eyes of people up north. You see, these radical abolitionists, man, they're seen as crazy. They're burning the Constitution. They're thumping the Bible, talking about Satan and stuff. They're talking about this big war where all these people are going to die. But then here are these anti-slavery people who say, hey, you know what? We think politics can solve this. We're not really out to destroy slavery in the states. Man, we just don't want it out west. We don't want it out in the territories. That sounded like a moderate stance. That sounded like something eventually a voter up north could get behind. And these people aren't crazy. They're not burning the Constitution. In fact, they're standing by it. They're standing by the law. They just don't want slavery to spread out west. And last I checked, the government has the right to stop the spread of slavery, they would have said. Remember, the Northwest Ordinance said you couldn't have slavery north in the Northwest Territory. And remember, the Missouri Compromise said you couldn't have slavery north of 3630 out in the territories. The government has the right to stop the spread of slavery, people said. So their historical impact on the North is the radical abolitionists made anti-slavery look moderate. They made Abraham Lincoln electable. Their historical impact on the South, they just made it that much easier for the South to secede in 1860, 1861. Southerners had had enough of decades of being ridiculed, derided, called evil and Satan. So that when the time came to break away after the 1860 election, it wasn't that hard for the South to secede. In fact, there are a lot of Southerners who said, "Thank goodness, it's about time. We should have seceded years ago." So one more time, their historical impact on the South is they made it real easy for the South to walk away and secede. All right, so we've looked at the differences between the sections in an economic sense, kind of explained how the North will go on to win, the South will go on to lose. We've looked at the institution of slavery and the hold that it had on the South, not only its economy, but its social order. And now we've looked at those who oppose the institution of slavery, whether it be abolitionist or anti-slavery. So now what we're going to do with the remainder of our course is answer a basic question. As America heads west, will slavery head west? And you'll see as we go through these next few topics that people living up north will say, we don't want slavery to spread out west into the territories. And people down south will say, by God, it should have the right to extend on out into the west.